All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee for Friday, January 24th. We are starting today with a briefing from the Maryland Department of Agriculture on highly pathogenic avian influenza, obviously a really important issue. Maryland has, I think, over 550 permitted chicken facilities. It's tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of chickens. And of course, as our colleagues from the Eastern Shore will remind me, the chickens don't care if they're in Delaware or Maryland. So it's a really important regional and national issue. So with that, why don't we bring up Secretary Addicks? And I know you have a whole kind of panel of folks, so I'll let you kind of conduct who comes up and when, and we'll save all the questions for after you all are done presenting your briefing. And thank you for doing this on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. Very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important issue. As the chair said, the chicken industry, the poultry industry, is extremely important to Maryland's economy. And we are partly in a promotion role and partly in a protection role at the Department of Agriculture and in the state writ large to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure this industry is successful. So we're here today. I've got a couple of folks up here. I'll introduce Deputy Secretary Steve Connolly, who's been through this before in 2022 when we had our last serious outbreak. Rachel Jones is behind us, who can answer any questions related to how we're managing this from a government standpoint. Our state veterinarian, Dr. Jennifer Trout, is here to my right, to your left, who can answer the technical questions. And we've got Paul Pedito here from the Department of Natural Resources, who can discuss the wild bird side of this. So just very, very briefly, I'll start by saying that, and just laying the groundwork that avian influenza is a respiratory virus that spreads easily among chickens through nasal and eye secretions. So once it is in a poultry house, it can very easily spread. It is generally brought in to a poultry house by wild birds, but the wild birds aren't getting in the house. Probably humans are, so we're walking into the house. We may have caught, even though we have biosecurity measures, we may have caught some droppings on a shoe or on part of our clothing. It could have dropped from the roof line. It could have come in through ventilation. There are a variety of ways, which we can talk about later. But once it's in the house, we move from biosecurity to biocontainment. And it's our role with our colleagues on the Eastern Shore in Delaware and also in Virginia and with USDA to move as one to make sure that we are containing the outbreak and if we do find another, to contain that one and to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep it from spreading. You'll hear a bit later from our Department of Health because there are always concerns from the public about food safety, food supply, and also human health, humans coming in contact with the virus. With that, I will say that, and I'll close mine and turn it over to my colleagues, that we are currently managing 4 outbreaks on our Eastern Shore. And there are 2 in Caroline County, 1 in Queen Anne's County, and 1 in Dorchester County. They were all caught on pre-market testing, meaning before the birds moved to market, they are required to be tested. They were all tested at that point. That is required of every chicken house all of the time. So that's not new. That's not only during an outbreak. That's required. And that's part of our surveillance to make sure that we're catching it on the farm and before those birds leave the farm. Since 2022, there have been 9 total Maryland farms, including 2 backyard flocks. So we have to keep in mind that there are, in addition to the poultry farms, the commercial poultry farms, there are hundreds of backyard flocks. There are probably some folks around the room here who have their own flocks. And we do register those flocks. Those folks are on our email lists. They get reminders about biosecurity and instructions on what to do if a bird falls ill. So last thing I will say, I've said that 3 times now, but this is the actual last thing, is any press requests should go through our Joint Incident Command. There is a command center that we have established with our friends in Delaware, Virginia, and USDA. And those questions go to jic@delaware.gov. Since Delaware had the first case, they flipped the switch and stood up this command. And with that, I will turn it over to my peers.
I think I'm next. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. For the record, Paul Pedito, I'm the Assistant Secretary for Land Resources at the Department of Natural Resources. I'll just offer a handful of brief comments about our role in this. Secretary Addix said biosecurity, in particular as it relates to protecting our poultry flocks, particularly on the Eastern Shore, is paramount to us. Our role as the wildlife agency in Maryland is to minimize the opportunity for wild birds that may be infected to serve as proxies for transmission to those poultry flocks. What we've done since essentially the beginning of the year is we stood up a wildlife response triage and collection team, started just with our personnel, and then just about a week and a half ago, we stood up an emergency contract with USDA's APHIS Wildlife Services team who are assisting in that effort. So we have statewide capacity, but I can tell you over the last month, almost all of the birds that have been collected by those teams are isolated to the Eastern Shore. Every county has had dead birds. The vast majority are snow geese. The next highest volume are black vultures, and then it's sort of a smattering of other species. So we'll continue that vigilance. We are also fortunate that next week begins what we call our light goose or snow goose conservation order hunting season. That is effectively an opportunity for hunters to avoid a number of the usual restrictions for taking snow geese in Maryland and Delaware, such that they can use unplugged shotguns. There are no bag limits. There's reciprocity between the two states for licensure. We waive some of the stamp requirements and generally make it easier to get access to and take those birds in great numbers. And most importantly, disturb them so they're not concentrated on any individual farm. So that's been our efforts to date. We'll continue to we'll maintain that level of vigilance going forward.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about what we do when we have a positive operation. We're pretty quick to act once we receive a positive. We quarantine the facility. We work to eradicate or depopulate that flock. We monitor the birds that are in that control zone and that surveillance zone. Obviously, we have to disinfect the facility and we have to compost those birds. And then we continue to test that facility as well as the facilities that are in the control zone to make sure that they're free of virus and that the birds are free from virus. As Secretary Addix stated, we make sure that we do pre-slaughter surveillance on all farms that go to harvest. That's done within 10 to 14 days on the Delmarva Peninsula. We have a really tight amount of operations down there, so we really push them to do it in a timely fashion and do that 10 to 14 days. When we have an infected premises and we set up the control zones, then anything that wants to go to harvest has to be tested twice within 48 hours before they can leave. If you're in the surveillance zone, you have to do the same thing. And then part of that testing for both of those zones is if you're in the control zone, you have to test weekly. And if you're in the surveillance zone, you have to test every 2 weeks until the control zone's released. So I think we do a great job of testing and monitoring on the Eastern Shore. We also do a great job of making sure that biosecurity is in place on all of these operations. And we really do try to prevent the disease.
Well, I don't really have anything to add.
Okay. We're happy to take questions from this panel, and then we've got our friends from Department of Health who can join in as well.
Okay, Delegate Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. It was very, very useful. I wanted to ask about one of the things that I'm seeing, at least in my area, in Prince George's County, zoning does not allow for people to have chickens in their backyards, but we know that from the neighbors and the roosters crowing that sometimes people are doing that anyway. And so there's an illegal underground kind of operation of chickens being kept by homeowners. Is there any way, or do you have a way to monitor that, to let people know, for example, when there's an outbreak like this, that's under the radar, it's not being caught because they're not legal?
Well, we have a poultry registry where backyard flocks are supposed to be registered with the agency. I think there's over 8,500 premises that are registered with us in case there is an outbreak, that we can be messaging to them. We can be doing calls to them to find out if they have sick birds and to tell them if their birds become sick, that they should be letting us know. We also, but we're not going to catch everybody. It's
But
like
do you have any kind of public outreach to let people know it's not a safe practice for, if you're not being monitored by the state or some agency?
We have a presence on social media. We have a website with a lot of information. USDA pushes out messages all the time. When we go to county fairs, the state fair, different public events, we push out the biosecurity information, as well as the poultry associations like Delmarva Chicken Association and the companies are all messaging out to the community and also to their commercial growers about the importance of biosecurity. But we're not going to catch everybody with messaging. So if we have an outbreak, we do actively go in a surveillance zone and try to find any premises that have poultry that is not registered with us, get them registered, and help us to be able to surveil the situation.
Yeah, it's just if it's in a suburban area where it's not supposed to be at all, it's kind of hard to find out.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think that's a challenge that we don't have all the answers for.
Okay, thank you so much.
Delegate Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you all being here today. Just very quickly wondering, number one, do you have any collaboration like with how that discussion has been with Delaware in this respect? And then number two, not sure if it's relevant or not, but given the fact that on the federal level, there's not really much collaboration that they weighed in or,
Well, I'll say that we've had intense collaboration with USDA and intense collaboration with our neighbors in Delaware and Virginia. As I mentioned, we do move as one when we're dealing with this industry on the shore because it's expansive, it's large, and it does cross over the borders. I've lost track of my own calendar, but it's between 5 and 7 regular calls daily between all of those parties. So this is truly an active situation, and we are engaging. And it's not just our departments of agriculture, it's our departments of natural resources across the various states collaborate and are collaborating with USDA as well.
And I'd just like to add, we share employees that are trained for a specific purpose. We'll allow them to be on a situation in Delaware or Virginia where we have employees from the other states coming to Maryland to work the incidents, as well as USDA.
Great, thank you. Any collaboration with the federal level?
With USDA regularly,
Okay,
yes.
perfect. Thank you so much.
Delegate Naraki.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary, everyone, good to see everyone. 2 questions. First of all, since I think you said, Mr. Petito, that every county on the shore has had at least one bird. Is that did I hear that right? Where at least one was found?
Correct, Delegate. At least one dead bird that was collected from Queen Anne's down to Worcester County.
Okay, could you expand upon that just for me to understand? So what does that mean from like for control zones or things like that when we're talking about literally every county? What is, or maybe that's a question for ag. What does that mean exactly?
Well, from a wildlife perspective, frankly, I don't see those numbers as terribly concerning because they're relatively small numbers compared to the tens of thousands of snow geese that are out there. When you talk about less than 300 birds across the course of a month spread out, across the entire shore, that's almost a good sign. We still have, another month to 2 months before those birds migrate north before we get rid of them. So, it remains to be seen what happens next. But in terms of control zone, Those are really triggered. Dr. Trout, this is your space.
Sure.
But
So the control zone is triggered by a commercial premises, not by a wild bird. So the birds that have been identified on the shore and have been tested have been disposed of, and we keep track of that. We keep track of it, and DNR keeps track of it, but we don't set up a control zone based on a snow goose event in Bishopville or the snow geese from Blackwater.
Okay, and then one other question, Mr. Chair, if I may. So I'm looking kind of further down the agenda here. I see milk mentioned on here, right? So what does this mean with respect to other species? Obviously, I know that humans are capable of, but does cows, pigs, like what else could be potentially exposed to this?
Right, so on the agenda, right, we're going to talk about the milk testing. So certainly dairy cattle can be infected with HPAI, as we know from California and all of the other states. In the past, we've had swine infected with it as well. We're obviously trying to prevent that, and we're extremely trying to prevent people getting infected with HPAI. So we're really doing a great job of providing PPE for farm workers, whether it be a dairy farm or a poultry farm, and at this point, kind of any farm, really.
Okay, so turkey as well, any kind of poultry?
Turkey,
okay,
right,
gotcha.
right. There's been positive turkey farms in the Midwest as well.
Okay.
So, yep.
Thank you.
Of course.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thankfully, we had a briefing this morning, Secretary Addix. I know you've been doing this on a regular basis, and really appreciate the way the department has stepped up to really make sure that we're aware of what's going on, and I want to thank you for that. This morning I asked about the radius. I know, and I think the first detection was the 7th of January, and I think 7th through the 17th, we had, I think, 209 farms in that 3 to 20 kilometer zone, so to speak. And we've since then added a farm in Dorchester. So what number? I think there's 648 poultry farms in Maryland. So now how many are in that circle that's being monitored?
So within the control zone as a whole, there's 223 premises, combining all of those control zones.
Right.
In Caroline 02, there were 77. With Queen Anne's 02, there were 63. Caroline 03 was 61. Those also include some backyard prems as well. And then for Dorchester, there were 22, and all of those were commercial prems.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Mr. Pedito, in the beginning, we were having a little issue with contact information, and the secretary spoke about that, how that had been improved. And can you tell us now how, if a constituent has a problem, what's the protocol? Do they call DNR? I mean, what number they call? Just so we get right on. I know you've stepped up with the contract with APHIS right now and whatnot, but if a constituent has a problem, what's the protocol?
So I think the first time we briefed some of the members, there was confusion when folks were told to call agriculture, and they thought that meant call Maryland Department of Agriculture. The confusion there is USDA is also an ag agency. That is our point of contact during business hours. So that is 410-349-8055, and that is USDA APHIS Wildlife Services. If it's after hours, we have our Natural Resource Police Communication Center. That's a 24/7 dispatch-based system. That's 410-260-8888. And if they call there, it's unlikely that we're going to send a unit out at 2 a.m., but that will go into our computer-aided dispatch system, and that will get routed to one of our wildlife response triage and collection team members. And then they will at least triage that call. If it's one bird, the person's comfortable appropriately bagging it and disposing of it, we'll deal with it that way, catalog it. If it's multiple birds, then we'll send a team out.
So NRP officers have the ability to bag birds?
We'll probably not send Natural Resource Police. We want to make sure that, so if a Natural Resource Police officer is currently doing waterfowl enforcement, and they're interacting with poultry farmers who have hunters on there, we want to avoid those connections. USDA, for example, if they were to respond to a property that has dead birds, they will actually ask that landowner to use their equipment to enter the property. So we're not cross-contaminating a place that they may have just picked up vultures on somewhere else. So we're using a level of biosecurity and limiting the number of people who have contact here. I've got biologists who are currently trapping and tagging waterfowl as part of our research. Those folks are not involved in this at all. So we're segregating who participates based on their roles in the agency.
Thank you. I know my colleague's going to ask a specific question. I'm not going to get, into that with you, so I don't want to step on his toes. But I did want to thank Dr. Trout because I did have a constituent that I think she's went there personally, and he called me up to thank me, for the whole experience. He said, I don't know what she's getting paid, but she deserves a raise. So just so you know, there are people out there that really do appreciate, the tough work, because it was a pretty good load of black-faced vultures that were very concerning, to the neighborhood, and they really did appreciate it. So it's always good to, get some good news,
Right?
Thank you for the performance evaluation.
In a time, put that on her evaluation.
Well, thank you.
But I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. We've got a lot of questions.
Great, and I look forward to hearing that quote again during the budget debate that will happen later this session. Delegate Otto?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pedito, you do a lot of tracking, as you're saying, and research and all that. Can you see a pattern of the movement of these snow geese, and if they're a predominant spreader of the disease?
Yeah, I mean, snows are, regrettably, that's a species that we haven't been able to get under control across the entire flyway, right from their northern breeding grounds south. We have arguably thrown the proverbial kitchen sink at them in terms of control strategies. What we're telling producers now is do everything you can to keep them from concentrating. They are much less susceptible to disturbance than Canada geese. Canada geese will leave if you approach them. Snows will hopscotch 50 feet away and wait for you to keep coming. So if you know folks who have flocks or they're nearby people who are keeping poultry flocks, they need to do whatever they can to keep those birds from concentrating. Let their ponds freeze, get rid of the bubblers, all of the, it's sort of the inverse of what you would do if you were managing to have good waterfowl hunting opportunities. And open those lands up to folks who want to hunt, because again, starting next week, they have sort of an unprecedented mechanism to control those birds.
And that, along with that, has there been guidelines provided to those hunting them of how to handle the birds and to keep from any?
I appreciate that question. I didn't do that in my initial comments, but one of the things we did was reached out to the hunting community with some biosecurity tips and guidelines.
Thank you. And for the veterinarian, I believe the length of time after a flock is tested positive and it's controlled and depopulated or what have you, how long is the time frame before that facility would be able to take birds typically?
So that depends on a lot of factors, one, right? And it's also very variable, right? So the birds are depopulated, the windrows are created, they're capped, then we do temperature testing, 14 days, has to get to a certain temperature. Windrows are flipped, same thing again. While all of that's going on, we're doing virus elimination in all of those houses. So you've got 28 there, so your first 14 and then another 14. And if everything goes good, so you're at 28, I think there's another 28. So it's about 6 weeks, give or take, before that infected prem can repopulate. And while that's going on, they also have to do their pre-placement audit for chicks as well to make sure that all of their biosecurity is in line in the way that it needs to be and is outlined in the NPIP.
So that can take place during that period of time that
Correct.
these other activities are.
Right. It can take place. The audit can take place during that time. You know, the control area, knock on wood, would be released after the first 14, so everybody else can go about their business. But that facility itself is going to take a little bit longer before it can be repopulated.
So basically, they're losing a flock
Yeah,
besides the one
correct.
that they
Yeah,
lost.
so they're losing the flock that was infected, and then they're going to end up losing the cycle of another flock, for sure.
Just to clarify.
Yep.
Thank you.
Delegate Foley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this update and briefing. So I know that our chicken industry here in Maryland is mostly focused on fryers, and that's mostly what we do. But my question is about eggs. And I just wondered, are there any protocol or is there anything being done with respect to this virus as it affects egg production?
So I would say all the same biosecurity measures are in place for egg producers. As you noted, our industry is much more heavily into the broiler industry than it is into the egg laying industry, or the egg laying side of the industry. But all the same parameters are in effect. In terms of egg supply, the challenge, you just heard the timeline on broilers. It's very different if an egg layer operation were infected, because you can't just put new birds in and they start laying eggs. You put new birds in and they start laying eggs weeks, if not months later, right? So if the egg laying populations, operations across the country were affected, you could see a supply disruption in eggs. We have not seen that to this point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, can I ask another question? And then my other question is, and you mentioned some of this in one of your answers about swine showing signs of getting the virus. And we know that there have been some cases with humans having it across the country. So my question is, how concerned are we that it's going to jump species, not humans necessarily, but to other animals, particularly other farm animals?
Sure. Obviously, our concern is paramount, right? We don't need it jumping species, and that's, I think we have the best probably surveillance system, the country as a whole, for testing. That's why we do this routine, pre-slaughter surveillance in poultry farms. I think that really protects the swine operations from something like that happening. And as you know, the little backyard farm in Oregon where that hog did come up positive, that was kind of a convoluted scene. Like, I mean, there were chickens in with the hogs and the hogs in with the chickens and all of those things. So we know that it can happen. But again, commercial operation-wise, swine farms have outstanding biosecurity programs. The USDA has a SHIP program that works with that for swine. And then we have all the biosecurity that we do on the poultry side with NP, IP, and the secure chicken supply. So I think if everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, we're pretty good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Delegate Ziegler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. Mr. Petito, I have it's probably a silly question, but do we need to be worried about backyard bird feeders? Should you be careful about touching them? Is there any concern there?
That's more epidemiology, right?
So we think that the transmission in like songbirds is very low. Okay. I mean, obviously, we would encourage people to wash their hands after they fill the feeders and come in contact with them, et cetera. But we're not really worried about a songbird infecting someone.
Okay.
It's more of a bird that likes, a carnivorous bird that likes to,
Right.
feast on other things, and then our lovely snow goose population.
Okay, thank you. And can I ask one more? Are the biosecurity tips for hunters available on your website, or?
Yep, yes.
Great,
I'm sorry.
wonderful.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share anything that we've sent, Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chair. We can resend those phone numbers and contact
phone
information
numbers,
to the
yeah.
committee. Happy to do that.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know there's some other speakers. My recommendation is that we go through everyone else you have lined up to speak and then do questions at the end of everything, even if you have to do a little bit of chair rotation. But I'll let you conduct that since you and Rachel put all this together.
Well, I thank our team, and I'd like to bring up our friends from the Department of Health. And thank you to the DNR team as well. And as they're coming up, I will say that on our website, which is mda.maryland.gov, you can find all of the resources and all of our press releases and all of our advice about biosecurity, including links to DNR as well. So we've been cross-messaging as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I don't have the privilege of joining this committee very often. I'm Nilesh Kalyanaraman, the Deputy Secretary for Public Health at the Maryland Department of Health, and I have Dr. David Crum as well here, who is the veterinarian for the Maryland Department of Health. I'm going to have him start first to talk about some of the food safety issues, and then I'll talk about the human health issues.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for again inviting us to speak on high-path avian influenza. And as Dr. Kalyanaraman mentioned, I'm going to start with food safety and some of the concerns that have come up naturally in regards to the developing situation. And I want to say first and foremost that eggs and poultry are safe for human consumption. The likelihood that infected eggs and poultry have entered the market is low, and proper storage and preparation of these food products further lowers risks. As mentioned before by my colleagues at Maryland Department of Agriculture, when the infection is detected in the flock, it's identified quickly, and birds and those poultry products from the affected farms are destroyed so they do not enter the commercial food supply. So those, in addition to the additional safeguards that are put on by the testing of flocks, as mentioned earlier, and then the additional federal inspection plans, really ensure the safety of both eggs and poultry as it enters the commercial market. Also, to touch briefly on pasteurized milk remains safe, again, for human consumption. According to the USDA and FDA, there is no concern about the safety of commercial milk products at this time. As everyone here is aware that these commercial milk products are required to go through a process called pasteurization before they can be sold for human consumption. And again, this pasteurization process has been examined and has been proven to effectively kill not only bacteria and viruses, including this H5N1 virus that may be present within these dairy products or so forth. I also wanted to briefly touch on the question that may come in regarding raw milk, because that is something that we have talked about quite a bit. Raw milk sales for human consumption, again, as everybody is aware, is illegal in Maryland. And MDH continues to oppose that raw milk for human consumption now more than ever because of that risk for high path or H5 in the raw milk. Again, MDH, we again support FDA's longstanding position that raw milk should not be consumed by people, and again, continue to advise consumers against consuming either raw, unpasteurized milk, as it can contain not only dangerous microorganisms, but potentially the H5N1 virus. So again, these are the salient points regarding the food safety. I'd like to turn it back to my colleague, Dr. Kalyanaraman, to continue regarding the human side and any pertinent health issues.
Thank you. And so, of course, we're all aware of multiple cases of humans getting H5N1, the high-path avian influenza, across the country. As of the beginning of this week, there have been 67 cases in humans, with one fatality in somebody who had a number of health conditions. I think the important thing to note is that a lot of the concern here is not just on the livestock and poultry side, but also on the potential for transmission and potentially mutations that can make this a pandemic. We've all lived through one of that, a pandemic recently, and a lot of the biosecurity measures that are in place are really meant to mitigate it for both of those populations, whereas historically it's really been focused only on the ag side of things. The CDC continues to note that the human health risk is low. Typical symptoms are typical flu symptoms, things like sore throat, fevers, aches, runny nose. We do have protocols in place where on affected farms, we screen people who are on the farm, workers and others, for symptoms. We have robust testing for H5N1, the specific virus in this instance, which may or may not be tested routinely in labs, but if it is not tested for, is sent to the state lab for further testing to ensure that we are typing what type of influenza A virus it is. Obviously, those who are working with livestock or poultry are going to be at higher risk, and so there are recommendations on the types of precautions to be taking, including PPE to reduce the exposure to virus potentially, and certainly in the instance of a positive either flock or livestock, there are additional precautions that are put into place. We do have antivirals for this that are commercially available, things like Tamiflu, and we also do have stockpiles of medication if we see a large enough number of people who need to be treated. So far, we have not seen any person-to-person transmission across the country. The vast majority have been attributed to animal-person transmission, with a few instances where the transmission mode is uncertain. I'm going to stop there, and I think we're open to take any questions.
Great. Before we do any questions, Mr. Secretary, I think there are some other speakers, maybe. Secretary Adams, I'm not sure, just based on the agenda, or maybe everyone's covered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Vice Chair, members of the committee. Very briefly, I'll touch on the economic impact here in Maryland. So we have over 500 commercial poultry farms here in Maryland and over 8,000 backyard flocks that are registered. And so some of the impact on that has already been discussed. So the economic impact for those particular commercial operations can be significant, as it's been discussed. You lose at least 2 cycles of production, and so that means whatever revenue that farm would have brought in during that time is now going to be lost. There is reimbursement or compensation available for those farms. The Animal Health Protection Act authorizes APHIS through the USDA to provide indemnity payments to those farms for birds and eggs that had to be destroyed or depopulation during disease response. So APHIS also provides compensation for disposal activities and virus elimination activities. And so the cost of HPAI goes beyond the value of the destroyed flocks and the cleanup work, but USDA's ability to pay indemnity is limited by their specific terms defined in the Animal Health Protection Act. And so there is an economic loss to those whose flocks are impacted or their poultry are impacted by the virus. But as the Secretary already mentioned earlier, we don't anticipate, it's hard to predict, but we don't anticipate that consumers will see a significant increase, but we can't guarantee that either because we just don't know if the cases are going to continue to increase here in Maryland and if that will trickle down to the consumer.
Great. Rachel, are the backyard flocks, those aren't eligible for that USDA program though, correct? Just the commercial providers? Okay. And does the state assist the commercial providers navigating that federal process, or we just shift them right over to USDA? And
as part of Incident Command, Steve, as part of Incident Command and our partnership with USDA there, they do work directly with the producer to try to help them get through that process to be reimbursed, correct?
Yeah, there's actually a case manager that is assigned to the individual farm, and they help walk the grower through the process of applying for the indemnity.
Great.
As well as working with the company who actually owns the birds.
great. Okay. Mr. Secretary, I just want to make sure everyone who's going to speak has spoken and you're now just available for questions. Is that?
I believe that is the case.
Okay.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Boyce.
Mr. Chair, thank you guys so much for being here to explain all of this and provide us the information to act and support and not hopefully panic. I want to go back to Chair Healy's question about backyard birds that are not registered.
Yes.
Through that incident command, could neighbors, unfortunately, I'm sorry if you've got an illegal backyard flock, could report those flock to your incident command or to ag?
They could report that to the Maryland Department of Agriculture.
Yeah.
I will tell you, because I have personal knowledge of at least one backyard flock that was registered because they saw this on the news.
Okay.
They saw it on the news, and it said backyard flock owners who are registered with the state are receiving information about biosecurity measures. Mm-hmm. And they realized they were not, in fact, registered with the state, and we did receive their registration. So.
And then also to her point, if the jurisdiction doesn't allow it, and folks still have it, and could they still register with you as a backyard flock, although it's not zoned or allowed at the local level?
I believe that is the case.
Okay.
But we'll verify that.
Am I able to tell if my neighbor's backyard is registered?
Yeah, so we have a database for the backyard flocks that are registered in the state. So if you called in and gave us the name, we can hunt that down.
Okay, so you can check it with you all, but it's not an online portal. Okay, Delegate Lehman?
Mr. Chair, and just similarly to the points my colleagues have made, especially Delegate Healy, we do have significant challenges in Prince George's with illegally operating backyard chickens and roosters. And my request would just be, understanding this is not your focus, that the same kind of messaging you've talked about you have on social media and the different ways you're getting to folks out there, that you coordinate with the local animal management agencies so that those folks know what to do if they get a complaint. They're the ones on the ground that see these things, that they know who to call at the state level and where to get help. That would be very useful.
Excellent suggestion, and we'll also make sure that we're reaching out messaging-wise a little further.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, if you could mention to the members here about the auditors. I know that there's enormous demand here, 228 farms right now, and they all have to go through a USDA audit. And I know there's a shortage of those. I think that you've done some additional training, but you can see where you got to go through this 6-week period. There's a huge demand for that USDA audit. And can you kind of give us a little rundown about that, if you would?
Certainly, and thank you for the question, Mr. Delegate. So the USDA instituted a new biosecurity audit, which farms must go through before. I guess they can do it as they receive birds, but it sure makes sense to go through it before you receive birds. And then I think is the thought process, if and when there are more than enough inspectors. Right now, we are at the point where we have worked with USDA, who has a number of their own inspectors, and some trainers who are training other inspectors to train a number of our staff to become inspectors. My understanding is the same is ongoing with Delaware and Virginia as well, so that we can stand up many more inspectors so that if unfortunately this continues, we will have more than enough on-the-ground folks who have been trained by USDA to act as auditors to go through and complete that process.
Thank you. Because I mean, that's
because time is of the essence.
That's a key part of this whole process, is that USDA auditor, and I know you've taken steps to make certain that that's been, that has been bolstered up, so we have more personnel. And I just wanted the committee to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. You mentioned a lot of coordination with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is wonderful. Is there also coordination with the United States Department of Health and Human Services? Do they have a role here?
They're through our animal vet team. There are regular calls that involve DHS and also CDC and FDA, I believe, as well.
And NASDA.
And NASDA?
Yeah.
NASDA, which is our National State Departments of Agriculture organization.
Okay, I just want to be really clear. The Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, there's ongoing communication.
Excuse me, yes, HHS, CDC, FDA.
I asked because I noticed there was a stop communication order for Health and Human Services in the new administration, but there were exceptions for certain types of emergencies. I just want to be sure this is one of those exceptions, so they are still communicating.
You'd have to confirm that.
I have no idea.
We'll have to wait until the next regularly scheduled call, and we can let you know.
Okay, well, I look forward to hearing that follow-up from Rachel. Great. I do not see any other questions. So thank you all for being here again on a Friday and your hard work on this challenging issue. Colleagues, the system needs to reset, so we will take a 3-minute pause before our bill hearing. So fill up that cup of coffee and see you in 3 minutes.
Thank you.